Hello and welcome to our fourth Bruin Career Insights event here on YouTube Live. My name is Angela Scales. I'm a fellow Bruin, and I serve as the Senior Director of Bruin Connections here at the UCLA Alumni Association. Thank you all for joining us tonight as we dive into startup culture and how to get a job in the startup space. Bruin Career Insights focuses on career development resources for every stage of the career life cycle. In addition to this series, a great career resource is UCLA One. We hope you'll utilize UCLA One as a tool and a resource for professional development and networking. You can check out the job postings and you can share your professional achievements. If you're not familiar with the site, it's just uclaone.com. One quick housekeeping measure. In the upper right-hand corner of the screen, you should see the live chat function. Using the live chat, send us any questions you have throughout the session. We'll try to answer as many of them as possible. After tonight's event, we'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for upcoming topics and industries. You can email us at careerprograms@alumni.ucla.edu with any thoughts. Also, a quick thank you to our Blue, Gold, and Life members for making events like this possible. It's through your generous contributions and continued support that we're able to provide career programming and resources for all Bruins. If any of you are interested in becoming a member, you can see a link in the live chat function. And now on to our main event. Our speaker tonight is Vikas Gupta, a double Bruin who got his degree in business economics in 2003 and his MBA from Anderson in 2011. Vikas recently became the Vice President of Product and Strategy at the Baby Box Company here in Los Angeles. So Vikas, why don't we get started by having you tell us a little bit about your background and how you found your way to the Baby Box Company?
Yes, of course. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me on this event. And thank you to all the viewers out there. I certainly hope you find this valuable, and please do take advantage of the Q&A function so that anything that's sort of a burning need on your side, we make sure we get a chance to address. So in terms of my background, I guess starting from college, so as Angela said, I graduated in 2003. While I was here, I studied I did my major in business economics, and I did a minor in political science. Immediately after undergrad, I spent 2 years as a business analyst at McKinsey Company out of the Chicago office, where I worked in decidedly old school industries. I did the majority of my projects in insurance operations and strategy, and then I did one project each in airlines, chemicals, and financial services products, loan products, sorry. And I think it was really that experience that pointed me towards tech, getting a sense of what the world was like at very large, multi-billion-dollar, multinational companies, sort of pointed to me, maybe that's not the world for me. I certainly knew at that point that I didn't want to be a consultant. And I decided to look at the tech world for a variety of reasons. One, just the speed at which things changed sounded like it would be much more exciting to me. And then two, somewhat related to pace of change, but also just the nature of smaller companies is that if they are growing quickly, there is much more room and opportunity for each individual to grow quickly with it. And so those were the two primary reasons why I decided to move when I moved to corporate, to go towards smaller tech companies versus going to sort of more traditional industries. So I spent 3 years at a company called LoopNet.com. I joined, they had just gone public a couple months before I joined. There were about 150 people at that time. When I left after 3 years, it was about 300 people. So I got to see sort of what that trajectory looked like. How does a company learn to be a public company? How does a company manage the transition from being 150 to 300 people? And I sort of had a front row seat to that. There I got to play a variety of different roles. I got hired in as sort of a utility player for, at the time, the head of marketing and the general manager of one of their subsidiaries. And so I got to do a variety of things across analytics, marketing strategy, operations, got my first experience in management, got to do some corp dev work. And so that was a fun experience. After that, I went to business school. So from 2009 to 2011, it's the Anderson School. While I was in school, I did a 6-month internship in venture capital at a local VC fund called Rustic Canyon Partners. That experience taught me that I was not that interested in being in venture capital. And I wanted to go to an early stage business and really learn what it was like to help build a business. And so I was fortunate enough to be introduced to the team at Factual, which I joined as an intern halfway through my second year of business school, and I stayed for 6 years. So I joined that company when it was 30 people, right after they had raised their Series A. When I left, it was 150 some odd people. I was one of the first 5 or so non-technical hires, and really for the first 2.5 to 3 years, got to, again, be a utility player on the business side, doing a little bit of everything from marketing to sales to operations to financial planning to strategy. And then as the company got bigger and roles got more formalized, I took over the marketing function and built out that team and also continued to run strategy. And so when I left, the team was about 10 people. And that was also a great learning experience. But ultimately, I decided I wanted to go back to the early days of the company. And so a couple months ago, I joined the Baby Box company, which is Series A. It's about 30 people. I joined as the head of product. We hired our CTO a couple weeks ago, and we are now building out our product engineering teams. And it's a really exciting time for us there.
It sounds like you got a really broad sense of opportunity in being in different parts of the company. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe a mistake you made early on in your career and what you learned from it?
Yeah, so I made a lot of mistakes in my first couple months on the job at McKinsey, and it was fortunate that I worked for an amazing manager who was still a dear friend and mentor of mine, and he sort of took those in stride, put me on the right path, and luckily did not get rid of me. So like the two that came to mind when I was thinking about this is, one, I think I made this mistake on like my second day after training, and I didn't know what I was doing. The pace at which they worked was just mind-boggling. I remember I was asked to do something, and it was like a Tuesday, and and I was like, all right, like, when is this due? And in my head, I'm thinking like Thursday or Friday, and they're like in 2 hours. So I'm like, okay, wow, reset of expectations there. And so one of the associates who had been on the project for a while, like, sat down and showed me what I was supposed to be doing. And so I started doing it. It turned out I did it incorrectly, which in and of itself wasn't a problem. But the problem was that I didn't actually understand what I was doing. I was just sort of mechanically doing what I had been shown to do, because I was just sort of like overwhelmed. And I'm like, oh, I got to get this done in 2 hours, so let me not ask too many questions. And the manager of the project, he's like, look, like, we didn't hire you to be a robot. We hired you because you have a brain. So if you don't understand what you're doing, you should ask. And then if you don't think what you're doing is actually fulfilling what you're supposed to be doing, you should, again, raise that and figure out the right answer. And that's really why I got hired. So that was a fantastic lesson to learn, although somewhat scary on my second day on the job. A couple of weeks later, or maybe it was a month or two later, I remember I was working, I was remote from the team because I was in the office for some reason. And I found out that I had made a mistake in one of my models, and that mistake completely changed the result of the analysis. And we had already sort of shared the results of the analysis up to the senior folks on the team. And I started freaking out. So I'm like, oh God, like, this is completely different from what I thought it was. So I dug in and I tried, I double checked, triple checked all my work. It's like, no, I definitely made this mistake. And then I was like trying to figure out what to do. And this took place over the course of like a morning where I'm alone in the office and no one to talk to. And finally, I just like there's nothing to do. So I called my manager, told him what happened. And again, his reaction, which is not sort of a reaction that I think I was used to growing, from an academic environment where you make a mistake and you're wrong, and that's it, like you're wrong. His reaction was like, well, you caught it. It's not horrible. Let's figure out how to deal with it. And so that learned, like, in a business environment, or at least in that environment, and in cultures that I will be successful in, and cultures that I like to create as a manager, like, everyone wants to get to the right answer. People understand that you make mistakes. So if you make a mistake and you find you making a mistake, that's certainly better than making a mistake and not discovering it. And elevating that so that people can figure out what to do about it is the way to go. And figuring out as fast as possible is the right thing.
Those are great teachable moments. So I know that startup jobs aren't always posted in the traditional channels. So how does one go about finding a job and finding those job opportunities in the startup space?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And certainly, so I think to provide some context to the rest of the discussion, and you got some flavor of it when I was talking about my experience at the largest company I've worked at post McKinsey, capped out at 300 people before I left. And since then, 30 to 150 and now 30 again. And so the term startup gets thrown around a lot. People talk about Uber as a startup, even though they have thousands of employees. And some people, like, I guess there's a lot of argument about what the term startup means. For the context of this conversation that we're having, let's agree that startup is sort of sub 150-ish, Series A, Series B, maybe Series C, because that's the experience I have. And to talk about beyond that, there's not a whole lot I can bring to the table. So in terms of those companies and finding opportunities there's two main challenges. One is actually finding the company, because many of those companies don't have huge brands. I mean, certainly as a hiring manager at the baby box company, I can honestly say one of the issues that we have hiring is that not many people know to look for us yet. And that's just the nature of being a smaller company, unless you have the good fortune of being very publicly visible, which most small companies don't. People don't know to look for you. So as someone who is looking for a job, how do you identify companies? And there's a variety of different resources you can use. And I think we'll get to those later, so we'll put a pin in that one. But let's say that you found the company that you're interested in, then the roles. So most companies will have job postings, but most companies, especially if they're growing quickly, will also be open to hiring people who they think are strong outside of those job postings. Because in any organization that is doubling, if not tripling every year, their ability to attract talent sort of organically, and if they stuck to sort of their hiring plan, is almost impossible. It's incredibly difficult to do. And so if they find people for something that they may need 3 months or 6 months from now, they're more than, some of them will jump on that opportunity. And so I would say don't necessarily limit yourself to what they are advertising they are looking for. Try and have a conversation with them, a real conversation with them about how you could fit in and see if you can create something. And there's different levers you can use if they're not, depending on how flexible you are. Like, I've done the intern to full-time path at Factual. I have hired people on contract to full-time because that's a way for both sides to test each other. I have friends who will only do contract to full-time because they are not convinced that companies are right for them. And so certainly, while I wouldn't use that if you need a full-time role as your initial offer, there are levers like that you can use to make it more flexible for companies.
And what role does networking play in potentially finding those opportunities?
Yeah, so I think, from my experience, I can say, like, every job I've had since I graduated college, including the McKinsey job, came through my network. And the LoopNet opportunity was created for me, and the Factual opportunity was created for me. And then the Baby Box one, they were certainly looking for this role, and that was, the company got put on my radar through my network. And so, that is my experience, but also from a hiring manager perspective, like, there is such a high risk to me to making the wrong hire that if someone I trust recommends someone, like that goes an enormous way, because I have so much more confidence than sort of just what I would pick up in a couple hours of an interview process. And so I think networking is incredibly important in general. And I think in startups, given that there is a tremendous amount of information asymmetry and information gaps, both with what companies are out there and what they may be hiring for, that networking is even more important. And so networking is a way to learn about companies. It's a way to get information about what companies are doing well and what companies may not be doing well, because none of this stuff is really that public. And it is a way to understand what companies may be hiring, even though they haven't advertised their roles. And it is a way to get your foot in the door as a hire outside of the hiring plan if you come with a very strong referral. And so those are all reasons why networking is an excellent way to go about finding a job in the startup community. So
how did you build your network?
Yeah, I would say like there's a few things. So one, I was fortunate. I think just the McKinsey network in and of itself is very strong and powerful. I think if we go back to the lessons learned, in hindsight, I think I could have done a better job maintaining that network. But it's there, and it's excellent. And certainly of my analyst class, I think 70% of us now work in technology companies. And then there's obviously the entire extended network. But beyond that, and as over the last 5 to 6 years, as I've become more involved in the LA community, I found that you get out as much as you put in. And if you're only taking, you're not going to get very far. And what I mean by that is, like, I am happy to meet with people who need my help. And generally speaking, I have found that people in the community are happy to meet with people who genuinely want help. And when I say genuinely want help, they want more than a job. Like, do not view this as a transactional relationship. It's very much about, if you want to learn about the community, if you want to learn about the company, if you want to pick my brain about how to think about your career, I'm happy to do that. If you really just want a job from me, that's totally fine, but there's a vehicle for that. And that's like apply. I think I'm getting off topic here. So in terms of how do you go build your network? So one, I would say, definitely be genuine about it. Two, don't hesitate to ask people for coffee if you can be genuine about it. If you do ask them, be prepared. Like, be prepared with what you would like to get out of the conversation. I always start every conversation after introductions with, like, how can I be helpful? And I would like to see a real answer to that, because I do want to be helpful, but I need someone to tell me how I can be helpful. For follow-up, thank yous go a long way. There was someone I once helped get a job, and I did not hear from that person, and that did not sit well with me. And five, like, pay it forward. And so people help me and I help them. And it's not, in a transactional sense, it's really like someone comes and talks to me and I like them and I think they're a good person and I can help them find a job. Like, I may not have a role for them, but I have a friend who has a role for them. Like, that's great. Like, my friend needs good people. This person needs a job. And then I sort of, next time I'm looking to hire someone, like, I will put it out in my network and say, like, hey, does anyone know anyone who'd be a good product manager? And then people will come back to me, and it's all sort of in this sense of we're all in this to help each other.
That is wonderful advice. So thinking kind of beyond the network, have you had particular mentors in your career, and what kind of impact have they had?
Oh gosh, yes. So certainly my first manager at McKinsey, the one who did not bail on me, he is still a dear friend and mentor of mine. And he is someone I go to with advice fairly often. And he will occasionally, much less often than I will, pick up the phone and call me and ask me for something. But that's just the way it is right now. At some point that may switch, but I doubt it. He's just a much smarter person than I am. But no, I mean, I think like I have been fortunate in that I have had fantastic managers throughout most of my career, and people who genuinely think of their job as helping the people on their team. And that is something I would suggest everyone to look for. Finding people to work for who understand that management is not about what the manager is doing, but really about what does the team do and how does that person make their team successful. And some of the ways I have benefited from mentors are, obviously introductions to companies. So I got my McKinsey job. I got into the interview process because someone I interned for recommended me to someone he went to business school with. I got my LoopNet job because directors I worked for at McKinsey recommended me to people who had worked for them who are now at LoopNet. I got my venture capital job because they were investors in LoopNet, and I got an introduction there. And then the venture capitalists introduced me to the folks at Factual, and then the venture capitalists and the Factual folks introduced me to the people at the Baby Box company. And so all along the way, like those were mentor relationships and networking relationships. And all along the way, when I thought about what is my career plan, I talked to people I trust. And as I got put into new experiences, when I was managing for the first time, when I was looking to hire functions that I had never done for the first time, I talked to people in the industry who had done it before and picked their brains and got their advice. And some of those people have turned into dear friends and mentors.
So a lot of times, especially with our younger alumni, a lot of talk about startups is about the culture. And so how do you find the right startup for you? And how would you say that the culture is different from a larger organization?
Yeah, so with respect to finding the right startup for you, there's a couple of dimensions along which you can break that down. So one is, are you interested in what the company is doing? And I am a firm believer in working for companies where I'm genuinely interested in what the company is doing. That is not a hard and fast rule. I have friends who are very successful, who for them, that is not the most important thing on their list, and that is totally fair. But for me personally, I know who I am. I need to be very much aligned with the company is doing. So I guess to step back from what I said, like understand who you are and if that is important to you or not. Two, I think you have to understand very much what is the culture that you are successful in. There are companies that are very successful that are very aggressive and confrontational and competitive. And that's just the way that company is. And it doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. It's just for a certain set of person. There are other companies that are very collaborative and team-oriented and non-confrontational, which can, frankly, if it goes too far, also be a bad thing. And you have to understand if that's the type of company you want to be in. The other things I would look for are like, who are you going to work for? And is that person going to be a good teacher for you? Again, if that is something you are interested in. How fast is the company growing? Because that creates growth opportunities. Then lastly, from a functional perspective, like what are you interested in doing with your career? And is this a place where you will get that from a functional perspective?
So in thinking about how you might evaluate a company, are there certain resources or publications that you check in on and read on a regular basis to stay up on kind of news across the startup world?
Yeah, so there is a lot of information out there today, more than I certainly can process with a day job. But some of the things that I look at, I think TechCrunch and VentureBeat continue to be great sort of roundups. I by no means read every single post. I do look at every headline every day and read a handful that are interesting to me. But just by looking at headlines, that is a good way to sort of get an idea of what's going on in the world. They will cover funding announcements, they'll cover major product launches, and you get sort of a handle. And you start building a sense of like, all right, like who are the companies that you're, seeing some momentum in the press. Now, there are companies that are very successful, that are building momentum and that are interesting that don't make it into the press. The press likes to cover certain types of stories. They tend towards consumer, they tend towards sensationalism, they tend towards events, but it's something you can do. I just about a year ago, I got introduced to something called Stratechery. It is paid. They do one free a week. but I've found it an amazing. It is more strategy analysis on a handful of companies, but it has definitely impacted the way I think about the business.
So picturing that now.
Sorry, wait.
Oh.
Sorry, I was just taking. I was taking a break to drink. A few other things. So I love Fred Wilson's blog, Brad Feld's blog, Mark Schuster's blog, Ben Horowitz. These are all venture capitalists who will write not only about companies, but also about the practice of venture capital and startups in general. Those are good learning opportunities, also good ways to stay up on what's going on. I think for LA locally, Built in LA and SoCal Tech have become good resources or are good resources for staying on top of what's going on in the local scene.
So picturing that our Bruins are now in a startup, but I know in chatting with you prior, you had mentioned that with a startup, there might not be staff specifically dedicated to professional development. So how would you go about identifying opportunities for professional development on your own?
Yeah, so especially when you get to very small companies, they may not even have anyone formally dedicated to HR. It's just part of someone's job, and when it's part of someone's job, it's much more about the legal and process, and it's much less about like people development, which is just the nature of being at a small company. As companies get bigger, they develop more. But that doesn't necessarily excuse the responsibility of the manager. Ultimately, in my opinion, it is the responsibility of the manager to make sure they develop their people. So if there is no process in place, if there is no quarterly or semi-annual review in place for there to be formal feedback cycles, you as the employee should always feel free to have a conversation with your manager about how you are doing and how you can perform better and what you need to do to improve. And your manager should always be willing to have that conversation with you. They may give you guidance on what they need from you on how to have that conversation productively. I have had conversations with people on my teams before where they ask me how they can get to the next level, and then I ask them what they would like the next level to be, and they haven't thought about it. And that's fine. Like, you don't always have to know where your career is going, but if you don't, then the conversation is not how do I get to the next level? The conversation is, can you, my manager, help me think through what I should be thinking about to decide where I want to go next? Because that is what you have to understand before you start thinking about how to get there. So ultimately, the responsibility is on you as the employee, but if you're working for a good company and you're working for a good manager, you should just have the conversation with them. And then there's tremendous amount of opportunities outside of the formal work environment to learn. So if you want to learn new skills, there's things like Udacity and General Assembly and Code Academy, or just self-teaching off of looking on the internet. There's so much content on Medium, on LinkedIn, plus just books in general to read and expand your mind that you can use to sort of develop yourself beyond just what you get from work.
So in thinking about your career trajectory, and you're a double Bruin, you went to Anderson, I wondered if you could take us through that decision-making process, and if you think there are some pros and cons to getting an MBA when trying to break into the startup world.
Yeah, so one, I would say, like, these pros and cons apply probably generically. And I'll talk specifically about the nuances with respect to startups in a minute. But so pros, and all of this is very context dependent. So you have to think about it from the perspective of you as an individual, because some of these things may or may not apply to you. So one thing that you will get out of going to business school is a basic foundational knowledge set on business principles and skills. So finance, accounting, marketing, you will learn those at a very fundamental theoretical level. That may or may not be useful to you. For me, having come from business economics undergrad and then consulting for 2 years, there was not a tremendous amount of value there for me personally. But for friends of mine who came from engineering backgrounds, there was a tremendous amount of value there. So that is one piece. Two, network. It is a wonderful opportunity to network both professionally and personally. I made an amazing group of friends many of whom are now some of my closest friends, that from a personal perspective, from a professional perspective, people all go off and do wonderful, amazing things. And they're helpful both from an advice perspective, but also from like a very tactical like job search perspective. 3, it's a very good opportunity to try things. There is the summer internship that everyone does or should do. But like for me, I did a spring internship that turned into a summer internship. And then I also did an internship at Factual my second year that turned into a job. And so I got to do like sort of stick my foot into the water of different careers and opportunities. And that's really hard to do outside of the environment of school. It's not doable, but it's more difficult to do. Other things, it provides a structured recruiting environment. So if you are interested in larger companies that will recruit from business schools, so you want to go to consulting or finance or larger tech companies, they will all be structured recruiting, and that certainly makes the process easier. I don't know if it makes it easier to get an actual job. Some of the downsides of business school or the trade-offs. Oh wait, I forgot one of the positive. It's also a lot of fun. Like it's a tremendous amount of fun. So don't let that. Certainly, when you're thinking about ways to spend your life, not everything is sort of dollars on dollars ROI. At least the way I like to think about things. So in terms of the cost side, there's the dollars cost. It is expensive. There's the opportunity cost. It is 2 years where you're not earning money, and it is 2 years where you're not working. At least 7 years ago, although I think this is changing in different schools or at different points, it's less tactical. And this is where I guess we can start getting into some of the impacts on startup decision making. And so when I went to an early stage startup, I learned in business school how to do pricing with data. I went to a startup, we didn't have any data. We were starting, so we didn't have many customers, and so we didn't know how they would react to price. And so how do I think through that problem? And like the traditional pricing things that you learn in business school don't necessarily help you think through that. Likewise, I had to buy and implement CRM, and you don't learn some of those. So a lot of those very tactical things that would come up in a startup that don't come up in larger companies that have already dealt with all of these problems, you don't learn about in business school, and that's something to keep in mind. And then from a not being at a job and spending 2 years out of industry, the technology world moves extremely quickly. And so if you're not in it, you have to try very hard to stay on top of what's going on. And it will be almost impossible to be as up to speed as someone who is in the industry, especially in market segments that do not get a lot of public coverage. And that is just something you have to keep in mind. And so if you are thinking about trying to work for a company, industry-specific knowledge will be a critical aspect in their decision to hire you. That can be difficult if you are coming off of 2 years in business school, although you may be able to sort of leverage internship as a way to get your foot in the door and start getting up to speed in a way that's cheap and easy for them, so that when you do graduate and you do want to go to full-time, you actually know what's going on.
That's a great framework for kind of thinking through that decision. So before we go to the live chat, I want to ask a question or two that came in via our pre-submitted RSVP form. So one of these questions comes from Sean, and he said, how much should you reasonably be willing to compromise on pay when you're joining an early stage startup?
Yeah, so I think it depends on where you're coming from. So if you're coming from professional services, you'll take a pay cut, and that's just the reality of the world. You have to accept it. And I guess to step back, there is a market rate for startup jobs. The market rate depends on the size of the company and the role you're going into and your level of experience. Friends who are hiring managers can help you get a sense of what that market rate is. You can look on resources like Comparably or Glassdoor to get a sense of what that market rate is. And that's the market rate. So to a certain extent, like you can decide for yourself, like if the market is whatever, 120 and you're currently making 150, like, is it worth it to you to take that? I would say, unless you are going to a late stage company or an already public company, very much think of the equity as a bonus. It is not guaranteed money. Most startups don't make it. So I have always thought of it as gravy. That is just the way I choose to think about it. Other people don't. But this is, I think there's enough data now to suggest that more often than not, especially if you're going into an early stage, the equity is like unlikely to pay off big. So take that into account. And then, there's different levers you can use to negotiate on comp. Isn't necessarily salary. Our companies generally don't have incentive structures, but they may be willing to put one into place for you. Sometimes signing bonuses or relocation can be ways to cover a cash compensation gap, at least in the first year, in a way that doesn't impact their long-term budget. So some of it is when you're negotiating, try to understand exactly where the challenge is on their side, and then maybe there's a way you can craft something that makes sense.
So in looking to one of the questions that we got from the live chat, this question comes from Julie, and she asked, what advice would you give a student who's about to graduate and really wants to work at a startup?
Ooh. If Julie can clarify her question, that would be helpful. Is the challenge that Julie is facing finding a startup and getting a job, or she already has a job and wants to know how to go about it? Otherwise, this is a very broad topic to cover.
Well, maybe if you're a young Bruin, you're going into your senior year and you're trying to focus kind of your energy on what to do to best prep for that job search, and you know that the startup space is what you're most interested in, what are those things that that the seniors should focus on in terms of making them the best candidate?
Got it. So, okay, thank you. So I would say one, like if you haven't already, like start reading about what's going on in the industry, and specifically the industry that you're interested in. I have gotten a shockingly high number of emails from people who say, I'm incredibly fascinated about what your company does, and then know nothing about the industry. And that those two things like just don't compute. I never expect anyone to know as much as an insider, especially if they are coming out of an undergraduate program. However, I do expect you to know what you can find by looking around on the internet and spending a couple hours of reading. Like, I think that is a very reasonable expectation. Other things I would say are, depending on the function that you're trying to get into, start reading about it. Like if you're interested in getting into marketing, read about marketing, throw up a web page and buy some traffic. Like not like spend $50 if you have it, $25 on running a Facebook ad campaign or a Google ad, just to have done it before so you know what it's like. Like create a Google Analytics account and poke around, like watch training videos. If you're in product or if you're trying to get into product, like wireframe out an app that you have an idea for. Use some of the name of it is escaping me, sorry, but there's tools that you could like use Envision and build a prototype. Like you don't ever have to launch the thing, but like demonstrate that you've actually thought through the process of whatever job function you're in. And like in college, like you have so much time, like there's no reason not to do it. And these will be things that will show me, and I'm saying me because everything that I've said like is my opinion, so you should know that. That will show me as a hiring manager that you recognize that as someone straight out of undergrad, you may not have a tremendous amount of work experience, but you're going to do everything you can to bridge that education gap, which gives me the confidence that if I am going to hire you, you will go out of your way to get up to speed quickly.
So going back a little to something you said in a previous question, in case our younger alumni are still kind of figuring out the space, you mentioned equity in terms of that could be a possible piece of the compensation package. Can you just briefly touch on equity and what that means for someone who's kind of new to the space?
Yeah, so generally speaking, if you go to work for a startup, part of your compensation package will be in stock options. And again, I'm definitely speaking from the perspective of smaller companies that are not public or haven't gone public yet. If they're in that camp, they may be using restricted stock units, which is slightly different. But conceptually, basically what an option is they'll say, like, you get an option to buy a certain amount of shares. And since they're small and private, like, the price of those shares will be low. And then if they ever become big and public or get bought at a nice higher valuation, those shares will be worth more money. That is the promise. Sometimes it works out spectacularly, and most of the time it doesn't work out. But since you haven't bought them, like, there's no real money left on the table. You don't get them up front. So they all generally come with vesting. The standard vesting schedule is 4 years with a 1-year cliff. So that means you will, after 12 months, you will get 1/4 of the options, or 1/4 will have vested, which means at that point you can exercise them and own them. And then 1/48 will vest monthly after that. There are companies that are known for having other vesting schedules. I think Snap is one that was well-known or infamous, depending on how you view it, for having a less employee-friendly vesting schedule, but the sort of 4 years with the 1-year cliff is fairly standard. Other things to think about with respect to options are there are lots of weird tax rules when it comes to options that I'm not going to go into. But certainly if you are exercising options or that is a significant financial issue, you should definitely look into the tax implications of whatever you're doing.
So I know you've been really involved in our alumni mentor program. So when thinking about fellow Bruins and utilizing the network, what would be maybe your do's and don'ts of reaching out to you as a fellow Bruin, whether it's through UCLA One or just through the network, in terms of how best to utilize that relationship, but also, as you mentioned earlier, not make it transactional?
Yeah, so I am always happy to help people where I can actually be helpful. So what I mean by that is, one, don't just ask me for a job. If all you want is a job and we don't know each other, then, like, you are effectively just applying, but you are sort of doing it veiled under the guise of networking, which is for me at least something that I'm not a huge fan of. However, if I can be genuinely helpful, if you are trying to think through your career, you have some questions about the functions I've done, maybe some of the industries I've been in, I'm generally happy to speak to you. Be clear in your email about be clear in how I can be helpful. And the more explicit you are, the better I can help you. And then if I can't be helpful, I will be honest and say I can't be helpful, and I might suggest some other people. And really, like, be strategic about who you reach out to. Don't just reach out to everyone. Like, there are industries, like quote unquote, I am interested in technology because I have seen you work in technology. I would like to learn about technology. Like that, like, I don't even know what to do with that. But I have gotten stuff like that. But if it's like, oh, I saw that you worked for a mobile location data company, I am interested in data businesses. This is why I'm interested. Here are ways I think you can help me. Okay, that shows that you actually studied as to why it can be helpful. Or I heard you on this chat say that you spent 6 months in venture capital and decided it wasn't for you. I'm interested in knowing more why. Like, okay, like, I can actually opine on that in some reasonably intelligent way.
That's great advice. So before we wrap up, we have one more question from the live chat. They ask, what are several qualities or characteristics that startups usually look for in employees?
Yeah, so I will answer this as what I look for in employees. I don't want to be sort of speaking for an industry as a whole. So what I look for in the people that I hire are one, and I have a framework which I'm going to butcher because I haven't fully thought through it. But generally, I like to break down the way I think about hiring into, okay, so do they have domain knowledge? So do they have industry specific knowledge? And if you're a new student, like if you're a fresh graduate, the answer is probably not, which is fine. Like depending on the role I'm hiring for, that may or may not be applicable. But that is a question I ask. Two, like what is their level of functional knowledge? So if I'm hiring for product marketing, like how much do they know about product marketing? How much experience do they have in product marketing? So that is the second set of things I look at. And again, if you're straight out of school, like you're probably not going to have a lot of experience there, but that's fine because for entry level roles, like the requirements there aren't as high. Three, like what is your sort of foundational skill set? So are you good? Are you good? That's like horrible communication. Do you have good communication skills, both verbal and nonverbal? I have asked to see writing samples. I don't necessarily care if they're from school or from not school, but I like to see writing samples if I'm hiring for a job that has requirements around writing. If I'm hiring for a designer, I will obviously like to see your portfolio. So communication skills, analytical thinking, problem solving. Can you think through a problem? Can you structure it in your head? Can you ask the right questions to get more information? Do you exhibit intellectual curiosity? Do you exhibit drive and passion in something? Are you going to be the type of person who's going to go the extra mile to get the job done? Are you going to be the type of person where if you run into something that you haven't encountered before, are you going to try and figure it out for yourself? Or are you going to just come to me every single time? And how is that going to work? And so those are sort of everything that I put in the foundational skills category. And then there's fit and personality. That gets, that is a tricky area. Different people have different perspectives on it, and certainly, that can be a challenge in certain companies. I mean, for me, like at the end of the day, there are some basics about just being like a polite and functional human being, and that goes a long way in my book from a fit and personality perspective. And then I'm trying to think. And I think those are generally like the broad categories in terms of qualities and characteristics that I look for.
Thank you so much, Vikas. Your advice and your insights have been so helpful in really shedding light on some of the challenges and the opportunities around getting into the startup space. To everyone who's watching, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for participating in the discussion. If you missed a portion of tonight's event and you want to share it with others, it's available immediately on our YouTube channel, the UCLA Alumni Channel. And we want your thoughts about upcoming topics for the program. So we want to bring you tailored programming, but we can't do that without your input. So send us an email at careerprograms@alumni.ucla.edu. And thank you again to Vikas and to everybody for being a part of the discussion. And lastly, a thank you to our Blue, Gold, and Life members who make events like this possible. We'll be back on May 24th when we'll be interviewing the co-founder of Sugarfina, who is a fellow Bruin, Rosie O'Neill. So until then, have a good evening and go Bruins.